They say true love demands nothing, but, interestingly, some people confuse love with ownership, affection with control, and worth with usefulness. And you know what's even sad? That many of us accept this as normal, simply because no one ever taught us how to distinguish a sincere embrace from a chain disguised as tenderness. This is one of life's paradoxes. The very people who should protect us are sometimes the first to break us, and those who arrive with no promises at all, end up giving back the identity we thought we had lost. Maybe you too have felt that silent blow of rejection, that you're not a note that no one says out loud, but you hear it anyway through gestures, glances, and silences that had far more than words ever could. Maybe you've carried guilt that was never yours, as if your value depended on fulfilling impossible expectations or filling emotional voids that didn't belong to you. And here comes the counterintuitive part. It wasn't your pain that weakened you, it was the lie they made you believe about yourself. Today's story begins with a brutal injustice, a husband who rejected her for not being able to be a mother, but it ends with a revelation many people desperately need to hear: the right kind of love don't demand that you give a life. It gives life back to you. Because sometimes, the person you least expect is the one who arrives to remind you that your worth has never depended on what you can offer, but on who you are at your core. And what makes this story even more powerful is the twist no one saw coming. While someone discarded her for what she lacked, a single father with 5 children chose her precisely for what she carried within her soul. A man who didn't need a womb, needed a heart. A heart life had tried to dim, yet one that still beat with a quiet, unbreakable strength. Before we continue, ask yourself something with total honesty. How many times have you allowed someone else to define your worth? And what would happen if today, right now, you discovered that life still has something better reserved for you? What comes next is not just a story, it is a reminder. A reminder that destiny does not make mistakes, it simply waits for the exact moment to show you why you needed to let go of what was shrinking you. He always said he loved her, but there was something in his tone that felt more like an evaluation disguised as affection, as if every word that came out of his mouth carried a hidden judgment about what she lacked, what she couldn't give. What he believed was missing in her. And the most painful part was realizing that, over time, he stopped seeing her as a whole woman, with a story, a soul, and scars, and began to see her like a failed project he was unable to fix. Every gesture of his seemed marked by a quiet impatience, a silent demand that made her try harder even though she had no idea what exactly she was supposed to repair in herself. The silences between them became invisible knives, silences that weren't peaceful but contemptuous, the kind that cut deeper than any spoken insult. She tried to fill those voids with smiles, with acts of kindness, with explanations and no longer cared to hear. Deep inside her chest, she felt herself shrinking, used to fit into a space where she was never truly wanted. And this is where the wound deepens, when you start dimming your own light just to spark a tiny bit of attention from someone who decided long ago not to see you. He never opened the book she was, he merely jailed the cover and tossed it aside as if her story wasn't worth reading. And still, she remained there, fighting not to lose herself, even as she felt the ground beneath her feet growing more fragile each day. The humiliation she lived through had no shouting, no drama, no spectacle, it was something much worse, a carefully administered sham, delivered in small doses, like a gentle poison that accumulates before the body even notices. He didn't need to raise his voice to hit her, a heavy sigh when she talked about her feelings was enough, or a dismissive whatever tossed into the air when she tried to share her fears. That kind of daily contempt erodes the soul. It's like a slow drip that pierces the air over time. She felt how, with every cold gesture, her self-esteem became more fragile, as if the unspoken words were crueler than the ones he dared to say aloud. Sometimes he looked at her with an expression that needed no translation, the look of someone who believes the person in front of them as fault. And then the most unjust question arose inside her: what did he do wrong? When rejection comes from someone who promised to care for you, your mind begins to invent faults that don't exist. She started seeing herself through his eyes, and those eyes were merciless. And the worst part is that she began to believe she maybe deserved that treatment. That emotional confusion is what traps so many people in broken relationships. And although she didn't know it yet, that fog would grow even heavier when she began carrying the guilt placed on her shoulders as if it were hers. Some sentences break more than a blow ever could, and she would never forget the day he delivered his. He said it without trembling, without emotion, without any concern for the impact. "You're useless, you can't give me what a man needs." Used like that, bluntly, as if stating an ordinary opinion, as if social expectations mattered more than her humanity. In that instant, her legs turned to cement, the air disappeared, her mind went blank. Because when someone you love reduces your worth to a biological condition beyond your control, they don't just reject you, they strip you of dignity. She felt a wave of unjust shame wash over her, a shame that didn't belong to her but clung to her skin like ink. He didn't soften his words, didn't explain them, didn't offer emotional support. He simply issued a verdict and expected her to accept it. In that moment, she realized he had never truly wanted to know her, never wanted to understand her fears, hear her silences, or read the pages she would have opened with all her heart. He jailed the cover and declared defective a book he never read. And although everything inside her screamed that it was unfair, a wounded part of her went searching for where she had gone wrong. That absurd quest would become the beginning of an emotional burden she carried for too long, a burden that wasn't hers, yet felt like a chain. The last night they shared felt like a silent funeral, like the last heartbeat of something already dead. He turned to the other side of the bed, placing a physical distance that perfectly represented the emotional distance that had been growing for months. She lay still, staring at the ceiling like someone looking at a sky with no stars, trying to understand how love had transformed into indifference. And the saddest part is that this indifference didn't appear overnight, it accumulated in small gestures, in avoided conversations, in absent touches, in words that were never spoken. She remembered how he walked out of the room when she tried to get closer, how he dismissed her pain with a naturalness that had more than any argument could. And while he slept with the ease of someone who feels no guilt at all, she wondered when she had stopped being seen. That is the cruelty of rejection, it makes you feel invisible in your own life. And worse, it makes you believe it's normal. That night, as she tried not to cry so he wouldn't hear her breaking, she felt something inside her shatter for good. And though she didn't know it yet, that rupture was the beginning of her transformation. Because right after rejection comes the most dangerous stage, when someone begins carrying guilt that never belonged to them. The most devastating part of that rejection is how, without realizing it, you begin accepting emotional leftovers. She became used to him not listening, used to him criticizing her sensitivity, used to him treating her dreams as childish nonsense. And that toxic normality becomes a cage that slowly closes around you. She accepted crumbs because she believed she didn't deserve more. It's a cruel mechanism, when someone repeatedly shows you that you are worth little, eventually you start believing it. And when you believe it, you stop asking, stop expecting, even stop imagining a better life. Her tears stopped not because the pain faded, but because the body learns to save emotion when no one offers comfort. And just when she thought that would be her fate, a small, quiet life lived in the shadows, the universe began moving in her favor. Because every rejection creates a crack. And every crack, no matter how tiny, is an entry point for light. She didn't see it yet, but life was guiding her toward something unexpected, something that would change everything. Because next came the heaviest burden of all, the guilt she carried that was never hers. And that is where the story shifts in color. There is a kind of guilt that don't shout, don't accuse, and don't point fingers, it simply settles inside the chest, silent and corrosive, until it becomes a part of you. That was the guilt she carried. It wasn't born from any mistake she had made, but from the constant insinuation that she was the problem, that something inside her was broken, incomplete, or insufficient. She absorbed that idea the way dry earth absorbs rain, quickly and without resistance. Because when someone you love repeats, directly or indirectly, that you are not enough, your mind starts sculpting a distorted version of yourself, a version that apologizes for existing. Every sigh gap, every dismissive gesture made, every cold silence that replaced affection slowly convinced her that she was the flaw, the crack, the missing piece. And the tragedy is that once guilt settles in the earth, it becomes a prison where the victim becomes both prisoner and guard. She didn't realize it, but she had already accepted a sentence for a crime she never committed. People who suffer rejection often learn a dangerous habit, they begin to internalize every pain as if it were their fault. If it was angry, she assumed she had triggered it. If it was distant, she believed she wasn't interesting enough. If it was cold, she convinced herself she wasn't lovable. This emotional distortion is one of the cruelest effects of psychological mistreatment. It rewires the mind to believe that love must be earned, as if affection were a prize and not a natural expression. She started walking on eggshells, afraid of breathing too loudly, afraid of asking for too much, afraid of being a burden. And the saddest part is that this kind of self-blame becomes so ingrained that, even when the person leaves the toxic environment, the guilt remains. It lingers in the body like a phantom pain, reminding you of a wound that technically is healed, but emotionally still bleeds. She carried that guilt everywhere, at work, at home, even in her sleep, as if it were an invisible weight attached to her soul. And she hadn't yet realized that the chains holding her weren't made of reality, but of lies. There were nights when she lay awake, replying every detail of their relationship like a detective searching for clues in a case that had already been solved, except the conclusion she always reached was the wrong one, I am the failure. She would think about every argument, every moment of distance, every cold gesture, and she tried to find logic where there was none. She asked herself 1,000 absurd questions. Did he speak too softly? Did he speak too loudly? Did he try too hard? Did he not try enough? That is the emotional torture of internalized guilt. There is no correct answer, because the problem was never her. But the human mind, when hit deeply, seeks explanations in the only place it can control, itself. She didn't yet understand that she had been conditioned to doubt her value. And like someone lost in a maze of mirrors, every reflection she saw of herself was distorted, cruel, unrecognizable. She blamed her own hurt for someone else's inability to love. And that is one of the greatest injustices a person can carry. One of the most painful consequences of emotional rejection is how the victim begins to shrink, not physically, but internally, quietly, invisibly. She began to apologize for everything, for asking questions, for expressing emotions, for needing affection, for simply being. Her existence started to feel like an inconvenience, as if she had to earn her place in every room, every conversation, every moment. She would minimize her needs, silence her desires, hide her sadness, all to avoid being a problem. That is how emotional guilt transforms a person. It teaches them to survive by disappearing. And with each day that she achieved a little more of herself, the world became smaller, darker, colder. What she didn't know was that this shrinking was not a sign of weakness, it was a sign of exhaustion. Her heart was tired of carrying a blame that had no foundation. But when guilt becomes habit, letting it go feels terrifying. Because if she wasn't the problem, then she would have to accept the painful truth that it was. And she wasn't ready for that, not yet. But life has a way of pushing the truth to the surface, no matter how deeply it has been buried. One morning, while looking at herself in the mirror, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. There was sadness in her eyes, yes, But there was also something else, a quiet protest, a small spark of rebellion, a whisper inside her saying, "This isn't who you are." That whisper was the beginning of her awakening. It didn't erase the guilt immediately, but it cracked it. And through that crack, a new question entered her mind: what if I'm not broken? That question terrified her and comforted her at the same time. It was the first step toward reclaiming her identity. Because guilt only survives in the absence of truth. And the truth was already on its way, slowly, quietly, preparing her for the fall that would lead to her rivers. She didn't know it, but she was about to step into a chapter where the world would shift completely. A chapter where guilt would no longer define her, and where a new life would begin. When she finally made the decision to leave, she didn't do it with the strength of a heroic character or with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where they're going. She left with trembling hands, a half-packed suitcase, and a heart cracked in places she didn't know could break. Leaving a place that hurts is never easy, because even pain becomes familiar after a while, almost like a distorted version of home. She walked out almost in silence, without dramatic goodbyes or long explanations, because there was nothing left to explain. What broke her the most wasn't the act of leaving, but accepting the truth she had tried to ignore, that the love she fought for had died long before she gathered the courage to walk away. As she stepped into an uncertain future, each step felt like a strange mystery of fear and relief, as if her body understood something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She didn't know what awaited her, but for the first time in a long time, the air tasted different, lighter, less suffocating. Changing cities was an act of emotional survival, a leap without a parachute where the only thing holding her up was the fragile hope that somewhere, somehow, she might breathe again. And even though that decision was only the first step in a long reconstruction, something deep inside her whispered a truth she hadn't heard in years: no one is reborn without breaking first. The new city didn't welcome her with open arms or warm greetings, but it offered her something she hadn't had in years: anonymity. There, no one knew her story. No one looked at her with pity. No one measured her worth by what she lacked. She could walk the streets without feeling the weight of his eyes, without being haunted by cruel sentences, and without hearing the heavy silence of a house where love had died. Of course, the fear followed her, a small, sharp fear that reminded her she was starting from zero. But starting from zero, though terrifying, is still better than living where your soul is disappearing. She found a hope quickly, simple, modest, but enough to afford a small room. A room she filled with borrowed objects, old memories, and the fragile desire to start over. It wasn't luxurious, but for the first time in years, she closed a doorway in her and felt peace instead of judgment. That sensation, so ordinary for many, was a miracle for her. And in that tiny space with peeling walls and second-hand furniture, she began rebuilding herself, quietly, slowly, almost imperceptibly. But healing is never linear. There isn't a specific day when someone wakes up and says, "I'm okay again." Healing is much more like learning to walk after spending too long crawling. Some days she woke up feeling like she could take on the world, ready to work, ready to breathe, ready to write a new chapter. But other days, the sadness crept in like a cold wind slipping through a crack in a window, sudden, sharp, and familiar. On those nights, loneliness pressed against her chest like an old ghost that refused to leave. Still, even in the hardest moments, something was beginning to shift inside her. She no longer blamed herself for everything. She started speaking to herself with a little more patience. She looked in the mirror with less hostility. She began to understand that what she lived through wasn't a personal failure, it was simply love given to the wrong person. On her walks home after work, she would sometimes look at the city lights and whisper to herself, "I'm here. I'm alive. I'm still moving." Those simple words were acts of resistance. And with each small act, she was reclaiming the version of herself that had been buried under years of rejection. One of the things that helped her the most was creating small routines that restored a sense of control to her days. Every morning, she made a coffee while soft music played, as if that ritual reminded her that she was still capable of creating beautiful moments, even amidst chaos. She began writing in a notebook, not to relieve pain, but to empty her mind. Sometimes she wrote down quotes from books, or phrases she overheard, words that made her reflect on who she wanted to become. And little by little, she allowed herself to rest. Rest without guilt. Rest without fear. Rest without feeling like she needed permission. Her rivers were slow, quiet, almost shy, like a plant blooming after a brutal winter, fragile but determined. She didn't know it yet, but those tiny sprouts of self-love were signs of the strong woman she was becoming. And life, unpredictable, stubborn, always moving, was already preparing something unexpected. Something that would shift her path again. Something disguised as a simple encounter. As the months passed, she felt something she thought she had lost forever, dignity. Not an arrogant dignity, but a soft, grounded one, the kind that comes when a person begins reconciling with themselves. She noticed she no longer walked with her head down. She no longer apologized for things that weren't her fault. She no longer felt that tight knot in her chest when speaking. Each day, she recovered a part of herself that had been taken from her. But even as she rebuilt her inner world, one thing remained lacked: trust. She had built a protective barrier around her heart, not out of bitterness, but out of caution. So when life placed a man in her path, a tired father with gentle eyes, heavy shoulders, and a story written in exhaustion, she didn't imagine that it would be the key to a new chapter. Not a rescue, not a prince, not a hero. Just someone real. Someone whose presence would eventually help her rediscover a kind of love she thought was forever out of reach. And that encounter, which seemed so small at the time, would become the bridge to everything that came next. Life has a peculiar talent for placing the right people in our path at the most unexpected moments, almost as if it were pulling invisible strings to orchestrate encounters that seem accidental but carry quiet purpose. That's exactly how she met him, not in some romantic, scripted scene, not in a moment of triumph or emotional clarity, but on an ordinary day when she felt tired, distracted, and still stitched together by the fragile threads of her old wounds. He appeared without trying to be noticed, with the silent presence of someone who has lived more life than a plant but still stands upright out of sheer resilience. She looked at him for the first time without imagining that this slightly disabled man with fun dark circles under his eyes and an unusual calm in his expression would eventually unlock pieces of her heart she thought were permanently sealed. He wasn't a prince, didn't have the polished charm of someone trying to impress, didn't carry the aura of a savior. Instead, he carried the honesty of a tired warrior, someone who had fought so many battles but still found the strength to keep going. And without knowing it, that quiet honesty was the first thing that touched her. She met him at work, on a day when he arrived with an expression that mixed worry, exhaustion, and a hint of urgency, the kind of look worn by someone carrying responsibilities far heavier than anyone else can see. Two of his children stood beside him, restless and curious, their clothes slightly messy, their eyes bright and observant. He asked for help with a voice that was low but steady, the voice of a man who don't ask for much, not because he don't need it, but because he has learned to survive without expecting anyone to offer a hand. She watched him with a mixture of tenderness and surprise. He didn't have the posture of someone who demanded service or attention, he carried the humility of someone genuinely grateful even before anything was done for him. And in that small gesture, a tired smile, a soft thank you spoken from the soul, something inside her shifted. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It wasn't longing or romance. It was recognition. Recognition of someone who also carried weight, who also fought invisible battles, who also walked through life with scars hidden beneath strengths. Two wounded hearts can sense each other long before words are exchanged. And in that shared look, something teeny, almost imperceptible, began to grow. It was a man shaped by life, but not from bitterness, from love. He had become a widower too young, and now carried upon his shoulders the emotional weight of raising 5 children who were full of light but also demanded a level of strength and tenderness that few people possess. When he spoke about them, even briefly, his eyes softened in a way that revealed both exhaustion and profound devotion. She listened and realized that his story wasn't one of complaint, but of perseverance. He wasn't proud of surviving, he was simply committed to loving. And that struck her deeply. His presence was not loud or overwhelming, it was grounding, like a quiet reminder that strength don't always roar, sometimes it breathes through tired lungs. She also realized, with a subtle ache, that he didn't expect anything from her. He wasn't evaluating her, measuring her, or placing her within some invisible scale of expectations. He was simply existing beside her, and that alone was comforting in a way she hadn't felt in years. He wasn't looking for perfection, and she, without knowing, didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be someone willing to listen. What made the moment even more striking was how ordinary it was. There was no cinematic lighting, no intense music swelling in the background, no magical spark that made the team freeze. It was simple. It was human. He saw her as someone capable of helping in that moment, and she saw him as someone doing his best to hold his world together. Nothing more, nothing less. Yet something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface, something neither of them had words for yet. There was a gentleness in the way he looked at her, a blend of fragility and strength, as if he were simultaneously capable of carrying mountains and in need of being held just once. She felt an unexpected empathy, a quiet connection that bypassed logic entirely. Sometimes life don't want us to think, it wants us to feel. And seeing him there, with his shoulders tense, his exhaustion visible, and his kindness intact despite everything, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, calm. His presence lowered the noise inside her. And though she didn't realize it yet, it would become the doorway to a healing she had never imagined was possible. As days passed, their encounters became more frequent, not because they sought each other out, but because life, persistent as ever, kept crossing their paths. Each conversation, no matter how simple, left a soft imprint on her heart. She noticed something unusual. He didn't scrutinize her, didn't search for flaws, didn't watch her with the cold eyes of judgment. Instead, he looked at her as one woman looks at another, sincerely, without filters. And that alone carried immense power for someone who had spent years being reduced to her defects. In his presence, she realized something profound: the value of a person is not measured by what they cannot give, but by who they are. That realization didn't arrive in a sudden burst, but grew slowly, silently, nourished by the moments they shared. And while neither of them fully understood it yet, the foundation of something meaningful was forming, not between the adults alone, but also through the children who, with their innocent hearts, had already chosen her long before he did. Those children would become the bridge to the next chapter, the chapter where emotional connection begins to deepen in ways no one could have predicted. The first thing that surprised her wasn't him, it was the children. They looked at her with that unique mystery of curiosity and sincerity that only children possess, as if they could see beyond her tired smile, beyond the layers of quiet sadness she carried, straight into the softness she thought she had lost. Children don't pretend, don't filter, don't hook, they simply feel. And they felt something in her that adults often overlook: warmth. During their first encounter, one of the youngest approached her with natural confidence, holding a small, messy drawing filled with bright colors, as if offering her a teeny piece of his world. That simple gesture broke an emotional barrier inside her that she didn't even know she had built. It's strange how, after being wounded by adults, we learn to guard our hearts, yet all it takes is the honest gas of a child to shake those walls. The children were the first sign that something different was happening, something real, something unforced, something that only authenticity can create. And that was the beginning of a connection deeper than either she or I understood at the time. As time went on, the children's casual encounters with her turned into small rituals full of innocent charm. Sometimes they waved at her from across the room with huge smiles, as if she were already part of their tiny universe. Other times, they ran up to her with the kind of trust that only comes from instinct, the instinct of feeling safe. She wasn't used to being chosen. For years she felt invisible, unwanted, or tolerated at best. But these children, with their simple gestures, were handing her something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. One of them, the shyest, unexpectedly grabbed her hand one afternoon, not because he needed anything, but because he felt safe with her. That sentence, spoken with pure innocence, hit a deep place inside her heart. Throughout her past, she had been treated as if she were a danger, a disappointment, a flaw. And now, a child saw her as safety. That emotional reversal was a powerful reminder that her worth had never disappeared, it had only been ignored by the wrong person. Without meaning to, the children became mirrors, clear, honest mirrors, in which she saw a version of herself untainted by judgment. Children have an extraordinary ability to detect kindness, even when the person has forgotten it exists within them. They began seeking her for everything, to show her a scribbled drawing, to tell her a silly story, to ask for help tying their shoelaces, or to proudly display a new toy. Their bond was pure, innocent, and unexpectedly transformative. In each of their small gestures, she rediscovered pieces of herself she thought had died in her past relationship. It was as if the children were gently stitching her back together without even knowing it, reminding her that not all love hurts, not all relationships demand perfection, not all affection comes with conditions. Each smile from them worked as a healing balm. Each hug was proof that her heart, once punished and reduced, still had immense capacity to love and be loved. And little did she know, those children were preparing her for something even greater, opening a space in her life for him, the single father who, without trying, was learning to smile again because of her presence. The children were unconsciously drawing two wounded adults into orbit around each other. One moment she would never forget happened when one of the children ran toward her crying. He had fallen and scraped his knee, and instead of seeking his father, the logical choice, he ran straight to her. That innocent act stunned her. The raw need, the natural trust, the way his tiny arms wrapped around her was as if she were the safest place in the world, it all hit her with an emotional force she wasn't prepared for. She lifted him gently, wiped his tears, and tended to his injury with the tender instinct she thought she'd never get to use. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't been able to understand during her marriage: motherhood is not only a biological act, it is an emotional one. Being a mother is comforting, listening, protecting, being a safe place. And that child, without realizing, returned an identity she believed fate had denied her. When the single father saw the scene from a distance, the crying child soothed in her arms, her calm voice, the warmth she radiated, something changed inside him too. For the first time, he didn't just feel gratitude, he felt admiration. With each passing day, the children didn't just grow fond of her, they emotionally adopted her. They clung to her presence with a naturalness she never expected. And she, who spent years believing she had nothing meaningful to offer, began discovering that her ability to love was far bigger than the limitations someone once used to humiliate her. One sentence echoed in her mind, something she had read long ago: children see light where adults see shadows. And that was exactly what was happening. While adults had reduced her to a defect, the children elevated her to a place of tenderness and importance. They saw her as valuable, necessary, irreplaceable. That pure validation, without conditions or demands, gradually restored something life had stolen from her, the right to feel worthy. And although she didn't realize it yet, the emotional bond she shared with the children would become the foundation for something greater. Because on, she and the man with tired eyes and a resilient heart, would begin healing each other in ways neither of them could have predicted. Their healing didn't begin with a grand gesture or perfectly crafted words, it started quietly, almost invisibly, in a way so subtle that neither of them could pinpoint the exact moment their wounds began to soften. Every shared conversation, every exchanged glance, every moment in which one paused to truly listen to the other placed a small piece into an emotional puzzle both had abandoned long ago. She, who had spent years silencing herself for fear of judgment, found in him a space where her thoughts no longer needed permission to exist. With him, she could speak without fear, express doubts without being dismissed, and reveal sensitivities without being accused of exaggeration. And a man who set to carrying the world alone, slowly discovered the relief of not having to be implacable all the time. In her presence, didn't need to pretend strength, could simply breathe. Their connection wasn't something they announced or labeled, it was something that grew in the pauses, in the shared silences, in the comfort that only two tired hearts can recognize. Without trying, without planning, without forcing anything, they began to yell at each other, not through perfection, but through vulnerability. Who had spent years battling the loneliness that comes from being the pillar everyone relies on, found something unexpected in her, rest. Not physical rest, but rest for the soul. A kind of relief only felt when someone finally sees you, not as a provider or a protector, but as a human being who also needs care. Sometimes they simply sat together and talked about normal things, work, the children, random memories, and in those conversations, felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. She didn't treat him like a hero who needed to prove his strengths, she treated him like someone worthy of peace. And that, to a man who had lived on autopilot for so long, was a kind of love that softened everything. She listened with genuine attention, with a presence that didn't hoot or interrupt. Her gaze didn't demand anything, it welcomed him. And that welcome, quiet, steady, unspoken, became something he began to rely on more than he understood. Without realizing it, he started opening up to her. He shared fragments of his past, pieces of his fears, and stories that he never spoken aloud. And in each piece he revealed, she saw not weakness, but courage. She too experienced a healing she never thought possible, the healing that comes from being valued without having to earn it. For years, she had lived under the shadow of conditional love, love that judged, what, measured, and always concluded she was not enough. But with him, none of that existed. He didn't see her through the lens of deficiency, he saw her essence. He noticed things no one had noticed before, the way she listened, the calmness in her voice, the gentle way she interacted with the children, the patience she carried even when she was hurting. He praised things she never thought were praiseworthy. And those small moments, those quiet recognitions, became emotional medicine. It was as if he held up a clean mirror to her face for the first time in years, letting her see the woman she truly was rather than the broken version she had been taught to believe in. Through him, she realized she had value that no condition, no diagnosis, and no rejection could erase. And slowly, the wounds inflicted on her self-worth began to close. The most beautiful part of this mutual healing was that neither of them intended to fix the other. Healing simply happened, naturally, effortlessly, like two rivers meeting and finding the same path. On days when he came home exhausted, she could bring him calm with a simple gesture, a glass of water, a quiet smile, a soft reassurance that he didn't need to carry everything alone. On nights when she doubted herself, he didn't lecture her or offer empty encouragement, he simply told her, "You're doing your best," and those words settled inside her like a warm blanket. Their connection was built on presence rather than performance. Each gave what they could, and each received what they needed. No pressure. No keeping score. No emotional debt. It was a rare kind of balance, the kind that forms when two people finally meet someone who speaks the language of their wants. And though they had no idea yet, they were forming a bond strong enough to withstand the storms ahead. As their mutual healing unfolded quietly in the background of their lives, something even deeper was forming: trust. Not the rushed kind that appears in moments of desperation, but a slow, steady trust that grows only when presence remains consistent. He began to see her as an essential part of his world, not because she solved his problems, but because her existence made life feel less heavy. She, after years of being reduced to a flaw, started to feel safe in a way she had never experienced. With him, she didn't shrink, she expanded. She didn't silence herself, she spoke freely. She didn't feel invisible, she felt seen. And while neither of them had spoken the words aloud, their hearts were preparing for a moment that would change everything, a moment in which he would say something so simple, yet so powerful, that it would break open the last locked door inside her. A moment that would become the turning point of their story. The moment they uttered those words wasn't planned, polished, or wrapped in cinematic perfection. It was spontaneous, almost clumsy, as the truths often are when they escape straight from the earth. She was sitting in the kitchen, helping one of the children with homework while the others played nearby, and they watched her from the doorframe with a mixture of quiet admiration and a vulnerability I rarely saw it. He had had an exhausting day, one of those days where responsibilities feel like swinging whetstones tied to your back, and still, seeing her there, steady and patient, brought him a kind of gratitude that tightened his chest. He walked toward her, sat down beside her, and looked at her in a way she wasn't used to, not searching for flaws, not analyzing her work, not judging, but seeing her. Truly seeing her. And in the middle of that messy, chaotic, tender domestic moment filled with children's laughter and lingering exhaustion, he exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of unspoken pain, and said, without filters, without hesitation. I don't need you to give me children. I just need you to stay. The world seemed to still around her. She froze, breathless, stunned. For the first time in her life, someone wanted her not for what she could produce, but for who she was. Those words were like a window thrown open in a room where she had been breathing stiller for years. A wave of relief washed over her so intensely it made her tremble, and yet, mixed with that relief was disbelief, because she had never heard anything like it. For years, she had been reduced to a biological function, treated as a failure for something her body couldn't control. And suddenly, this man, this weary, kind, imperfect man, was telling her she was enough. Not because of an ability, not because of a role, not because of expectation. But because of her essence. She lowered her gaze, not out of embarrassment, but because tears were filling her eyes with a force she could not contain. He reached out and took her hand gently, without urgency or pressure, with the kind of touch that says more than any beautifully crafted speech ever could. And in that simple gesture, she understood the weight of his words. He didn't want a woman, he wanted a heart. A heart capable of warmth, softness, and presence, everything she had always had, even when someone else convinced her she lacked worth. That realization pierced through years of pain like light breaking through a thick, dark fog. His words echoed inside her for days, resurfacing whenever she looked at the children, whenever she saw him fighting through life with dignity, whenever she caught herself feeling something she thought she had buried, open. She had learned to live on guard, convinced rejection was always a breath away, conditioned to expect abandonment, trained to believe she wasn't enough. But his words cracked that internal armor. A teeny crack, yes, but enough for a new truth to slip through. For the first time, she asked herself a question she had denied for years: what if I deserved this? The sentence "I need you to stay" carried a weight far greater than a romantic confession. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition, an affirmation of her humanity. He wasn't asking for perfection. He wasn't asking her to fill a void. He was asking for presence. For partnership. For love that wasn't measured, tested, or demanded. That simple request began to restructure her heart, forcing her to consider that maybe, she was lovable after all. What made his words even more powerful was the sincerity behind them. There was no dramatic tone, no poetic exaggeration, only truth. En knew loss. En knew loneliness. En knew what it felt like to carry too much. And yet he still chose to open a space in his life for her. Not as a replacement, not as a solution, not as an escape, but as herself. And that sincerity hit her deeper than any grand gesture would have. She was used to conditional love, to emotional transactions disguised as affection, to the suffocating feeling of needing to prove her worth. But here, sitting beside a man with tired eyes and a hopeful heart, she felt something she had never felt before: acceptance. Real, unfiltered acceptance. And acceptance is a powerful healer. His words dismantled chance she didn't realize she was still carrying, the chance of inadequacy, of shame, of the false belief that she was unlovable because she could not give what society demanded. In that moment, he gave her something priceless, the permission to stop apologizing for existing. That moment, though brief, became the turning point of everything. After hearing those words, she began looking at him differently, not as a wounded man needing rescue, but as a partner, a companion, someone with whom she could finally imagine a future that didn't shrink her. And he began looking at her not as an unexpected blessing, but as an essential part of his life. But his words didn't just transform their relationship, they transformed her. They freed her. It was as if his simple declaration had unlocked a door she thought was permanently sealed, the door to believing she was worthy of love without conditions. And although she didn't yet understand the full impact, that phrase would become the emotional armor she never had. But before a life allowed their happiness to solidify, there was still one last loss and a final confrontation with the past. Because the man who rejected her, the one who caused her deepest wound, would cross her path again. And the destiny that had once had her, was now ready to deliver justice. Destiny, although often unpredictable, has a peculiar sense of timing, almost poetic, almost ironic, almost as if it takes pleasure in restoring balance exactly when the human heart least expects it. That truth revealed itself to her on the day she unexpectedly crossed paths with the man who had once shattered her. The encounter wasn't planned or sought, it simply unfolded like a scene written by a eager hand. She was walking through the city center, holding the hands of two of the children, who were laughing with ice cream dripping down their fingers, when her eyes landed on a familiar silhouette. There he was, standing in line at a cafe, his posture weighed down, his expression hardened, his eyes tired in a way she didn't recognize. For a moment, Time froze. Her heart gave a small jolt, not from love, not from longing, but from the memory of pain. Yet there was something different, something she had never felt before in his presence: peace. She didn't feel small. Didn't feel ashamed. Didn't feel defective. She simply looked at him as one looks at an old book once full of painful chapters, a book already closed. That calmness was her first sign that destiny was stepping onto the stage, ready to show its quiet, unrelenting justice. It turned and saw her. And the shock in his expression was immediate, a flash of disbelief, almost fear. He stared at her as if struggling to recognize the woman standing before him, because she was no longer the version he had broken. She no longer carried the defeated posture, the apologetic gasp, the silent plea for approval. She stood tall, radiant in her quiet confidence, surrounded by children who adored her. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. His eyes followed the way one of the little ones tugged on her shirt, seeking her attention with natural ease. The look on his face cracked, a mystery of confusion, regret, and a dawning realization that he had underestimated her worth. The irony of the moment was unmistakable. The man who rejected her because she could not give him a family was now witnessing how 5 children had chosen her, freely, instinctively, wholeheartedly. It hit him like a silent blow. And though she didn't revel in his discomfort, she couldn't deny the justice of it. Some lessons in life are delivered not through revenge, but through truth. And the truth was unfolding before his eyes. He approached her hesitantly, as if walking toward something he was no longer worthy of touching. He said her name softly, as though hoping to ignite some old emotion in her, but nothing stirred inside her. She responded politely, calmly, with a composure that surprised even her. He tried to start a conversation, offering excuses wrapped in clumsy explanations, blaming stress, immaturity, circumstances. But excuses dissolve quickly when the damage they caused is too deep. She listened with the detached kindness one offers to a distant memory, not to someone who still matters. And the more she remained calm, the more uneasy he became. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he no longer had any power over her. Her silence no longer feared him. Her gaze no longer sought validation. Her identity no longer bent to his judgment. In that moment, she understood something liberating: she was healed. Not because he apologized, not because he regretted, but because she had outgrown the version of herself that once needed him. Even pity crossed her heart, not for the man he was, but for the man he still could not be. But destiny wasn't done. Just when he attempted to salvage his pride, he asked the question that exposed the emptiness inside him: do you have children now? He didn't ask out of genuine curiosity, he asked hoping to confirm she had failed without him. But before she could respond, the smallest of the children, a sweet, wide-eyed little one, wrapped his arms around her waist and leaned into her naturally, as children do when they feel at home. She looked down at him with tenderness, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead as he clung to her. The man who once deemed her useless watched the scene unfold, frozen, realizing how deeply wrong he had been. With the child still holding her, she lifted her gaze to him and said softly, firmly, almost serenely, "I have everything I need." Those 5 words shattered whatever illusion he had left. His eyes dropped to the ground, and something defeated settled into his shoulders. The truth was undeniable: she hadn't lost anything. He had. He lost the woman whose heart was bigger than the family he claimed to want. He lost the tenderness he never knew how to hold. He lost the life he was too blind to build. She walked away from that encounter not with triumph, but with closure, the kind that settles deep inside the soul and finally lets the past rest. She didn't look back. The chapter was closed. Ahead of her, a few steps away, stood the single father, holding grocery bags, smiling when he saw her, his expression softening with a warmth she had never received before. That simple smile, ordinary, human, real, erased any shadow the past had cast. When she reached him, he took one of the bags in one hand and gently held her hand with the other. The children gathered around them, forming a small, imperfect, beautiful circle. And as they walked home together, she felt the truth settle inside her like light: family isn't made by blood. Family is made by love. By presence. By choice. Her story, which began with rejection and humiliation, had transformed into a testament of resilience and rivers. Destiny hadn't been cruel after all, it had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal its justice. And though this is the emotional twist, one final breath remains: the story still needs a closing message, a final reflection that ties everything together with hope. There are moments in life when pain becomes a teacher, not because suffering is noble, but because it forces us to see truths we would otherwise avoid. And as you listen to this story, perhaps you recognized pieces of yourself, moments when you stood where you weren't valued, moments when you carried guilt that wasn't yours. Moments when you believed your worth depended on meeting expectations that were never fair to begin with. But let me ask you something honestly: how long will you allow your past to dictate your future? There comes a time when the earth refuses to stay small, when your soul begins whispering that you deserve more, even if you're scared to believe it. Think about it. How many dreams have you buried because someone convinced you they were impossible? How many times have you silenced your truth just to keep the peace? How often have you measured your value by the standards of people who never truly saw you? Life is offering you a choice, the same one it offered her, to rise. To heal. To rebuild piece by piece. And healing don't start with grand gestures, it starts with a simple decision, to no longer abandon yourself. If this story touched something inside you, it's because a part of you is ready to change. A part of you is tired of surviving and ready to start living again. Are you willing to listen to that part? Are you willing to take one small step toward the life you deserve? Before you go, I want to ask you one last question, one that only you can answer. What chapter of your life needs to end today so a new one can finally begin? Let this question sit in your heart. Let it work in you. And when you're ready, choose yourself. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and activate notifications. Here, we don't just tell stories, we open doors, we heal wounds, and we walk together toward a better life. Leave a like, share this video with someone who needs to hear this, and join me in the next chapter, because what comes next might be exactly what your heart has been waiting for.